The story opens up with the echoes of a fading dream from our main character. She'd always believed she could do anything she set her mind to. She had so much inspiration and a world of passion. And the world was her stage. She was the main character. She scrubbed the toilet she'd been working on hard until it shone a pristine white and hit the flush button. She let out a sigh, relieved to be done with her job. She took out her phone to let the homeowner know she was done via text. As a young girl, she'd always believed she was special. The owner acknowledged the text and told her where her payment was. But our main character came to realize later in her life that special people were the ones who owned homes like the one she was currently cleaning, while people like her, well, they just lived off the extra. She looked over to the table where the client had told her she'd find her payment and saw the envelope there. When she checked it, she was blown away by the amount of money she found in it. She'd barely had anything to clean and got paid a whopping $160. She acknowledged that she wasn't mad about the pay with a satisfied smirk on her face. Now that her youth was almost at its end, she was hardly noticed. She wasn't very talented either. So she just moved about, hoping to bump into some luck. On her way home from her job, she glanced at a poster on the wall. An ad showing a very pretty model. Yena Banhu, our main character, thought to be photogenic by the way. For our main character, her life seemed stuck to a spot, while others moved on ahead. In fact, she didn't think she was done getting ready to progress in life. Imagine that. But she pulled herself up from that pit of self-pity. She was still young and had time on her side after all. Everything was going to be okay. Everything was going to be just fine. Or was it? She let a curse slip out of her lips. Who was she kidding? She was 29 years old already, still an unknown actress who doubled as a home cleaner just to survive. Her name was Myeong Yu. Ironically, her name literally translated to fame. Myeong Yu walked up the stairs. When she got to the top, she realized she may have arrived home a little earlier than usual. She figured Hyunjae, her boyfriend, should be home already. She punched in the security code to her flat's door. She fantasized over eating her lunch while it was still steaming hot. While she was still punching in the security code, the door swished open, producing a gasp from Myeong Yu. A lady opened the door with a smile and said she'd been wondering who it could have been, trying to open the door. Then she mused that it had been a while since she'd seen Myeong. Myeong wasn't as excited to see her. She was none other than the model from the poster earlier, Yenaban. Myeong asked her what she was doing in her house, and the other lady finally realized Myeong must have been surprised to see her. She said she'd wanted to discuss with the assistant director, Woo, about their upcoming shoot. And she wasn't home alone. Apparently, Hyunjae Woo was in the house. He came out and was surprised to find Myeong had returned home. Myeong wondered why Yena had to come over to chat with Hyunjae in their house and not at their workplace. But Yenaban flashed that self-absorbed smile of the average celebrity and went on to remind Myeong that she couldn't just go about like everyone else. And the assistant director Hyunjae said that his place was free. Surely, she couldn't be imagining the wrong things from a very innocent visit. Myeong merely smiled with a sarcastic scoff and nodded like it made sense that Yenaban was in her house unannounced. Yenaban rolled her eyes and tried to reason with Myeong about how important the movie they were working on was to both herself and the assistant director Woo. She just had to understand. Yenaban was Myeong Yu's colleague, 2 years younger than her. Myeong recalled their college days. Yenaban was usually alone, and she'd always loved to gush over Myeong Yu. Myeong recalled one time Yenaban had come to her and asked what perfume she used. Myeong had told her she wasn't wearing any. A year later, Yenaban was cast in a film by an esteemed director, and she'd won the Best Actress award that same year. While she was receiving it, she tearfully dedicated the award to her family in heaven. It didn't really matter whether or not she was acting out the tears anyway. Myeong had been so happy for her junior, and so was her boyfriend. In the beginning, Myeong had been rooting for her. Yena was kind enough to take her out to expensive restaurants at the time to celebrate her wins. Myeong genuinely felt happy for her younger colleague and celebrated her accomplishments like they were her own. Yenaban never counted the expensive outings as anything. But things started to shift when Yenaban asked if she could call Myeong by her name. Myeong noticed that something had changed, and she'd not been wrong. Soon after, Myeong learned from Hyunjae that Yena was going to be the lead in a movie they'd been working on. Myeong was shocked to learn this because she'd earned the role. But Hyunjae explained with defeat in his voice that Yena's people had probably gotten to the producer first. They'd seen the script and said they really loved for Yena to get the role. They even offered to pay Yena's acting fee and other logistics. Then came the statement that crashed Myeong's mind. A small studio like Hyunjae's needed an actress as popular as Yenaban. Myeong thought it was fair and asked if she was out of the picture. Hyunjae explained that she'd never really had the part to begin with, and the director played a huge part in the decision-making, so he didn't have much of a say. But Myeong didn't really agree. Hyunjae knew she really wanted the role. She was in tears. Everything was happening all of a sudden. Hyunjae tried to comfort her and explained that it was just the way of the industry. Myeong didn't think she should have lost the role just like that. Hyunjae admitted that he shouldn't have broken the news to her. He tried to comfort her and promised her that more opportunities would come. Now, with all of that in the past, when Myeong looked at Yenaban, she felt uncomfortable. She was still at the door, looking at Yena, while Hyunjae stood in the background. Myeong bluntly asked Yena to get out of the house. Yena gasped in shock and asked her if she was mad, but Myeong didn't stop there. She asked Yena not to come to her house when she was not around, or else she wouldn't help but have the wrong idea. Yena slipped into character and began to stutter a response. Then she began sobbing, before she whispered an apology and breezed out of the flat, shutting the door behind her. Myeong stood with a blank face, totally ignoring her boyfriend as he called, "No," screamed after Yena. He turned to Myeong and asked her what her problem was, because she'd just ruined the plans for the shoot they had the next day. What if her actions had messed things up for him and ruined his actor's mood for the shoot? Myeong's mind paused at the sound of "my actor." Then she had to remind Hyunjae that she was his girlfriend. Why couldn't he think about how she felt? Hyunjae could have simply informed her that Yena was going to be in the house while she was away. Did her feelings not matter because it was work? Hyunjae sighed and said he'd not cheated with Yena, so it wasn't a big deal. Why did Myeong have to be so sensitive over something so petty? All they'd done was discuss the film. Then he asked her if they could just keep their work lives separate from their personal lives, and he didn't quite stop there. He told Myeong that just because her career wasn't working out, she didn't have to take it out on a girl who was just doing her best for hers. Then with that, he breezed past her, stepped out of the house and slammed the door hard behind her. Myeong stood in disbelief and looked down at the takeout she'd got on her way back. The food had gone cold and soggy. All Myeong had asked for was a bit of courtesy as Hyunjae's girlfriend and as an actor. But the real reason she'd been too tongue-tied to confront Hyunjae's attitude was because of the social hierarchy that had subconsciously formed between them. While the two of them worked hard to actualize their dreams, she was always somehow in the wrong. Myeong let the takeout bag drop to the floor as she slunk away out of the apartment. What really was the difference between all three of them? Hadn't she worked as hard? And what did she have to show for it? Supporting cast roles as just a friend in a movie. Why did life always make it seem like she needed more than just hard work to succeed? Maybe it was only by luck that she could get a good project to work on. The more she contemplated the difference, the more depressed she became. Myeong's phone beeped with a notification. Her cleaning business had an order. She figured she'd make it in time if she started walking to the location immediately. It looked like it was going to rain with all the dark clouds in the sky. Myeong walked through the street with her head held down. Life had really done its worst with her. And there was that stupid banner of Yena hanging on the wall while she passed. She didn't give the thing even the slightest glance. But you'd think things couldn't get worse, right? She saw the first few drops by her feet and stopped to look at the sky. Then she felt a raindrop one squat by her eye. As if on cue, the heavens let down all the water they'd been holding. When did it ever rain in the middle of winter? And it wasn't letting down. She ran as fast as she could to a nearby shelter, all soaking wet from the rain. She had a job to do and the rain was getting in the way. But she had some time left on the job order, so she figured she could just wait the rain out. She didn't feel the slightest bit lucky. A sad laugh escaped her lips as she thought about her day. While waiting in the shelter of that random building, her eyes caught a sign in the corner. The posthumous work of a young photographer named Eunmil was put up on exhibition. Muse On was the title. Very interesting for a photo exhibition. She found herself walking into the building for reasons she couldn't explain. It could have been because it was an acclaimed young photographer's posthumous work, or simply because she had nowhere else to go, thanks to the rain. She let her legs carry her inside, where it was invitingly warm. She would never have been prepared for the sight that welcomed her inside. There were photos everywhere, photos of herself. She'd been 20 at the time they were taken, and here they were on display, as an acclaimed artist's muse. And then she realized something. She'd shined so brightly, dreaming of what the future held. She held enough energy to turn heads in a room. But she probably had no idea, right? Myeong remembered a day from her college days like it was just yesterday. She'd been in the college drama club at the time, herself and a couple of other people, Hyunjae. She thought there was someone just outside while they were so engrossed in their discussion. Hyunjae stood up to check, but the hallway was clear of any kind of life. She apologized and brushed it off as a trick of her eyes. So they returned to what they'd been doing, going through the script for a play they were working on. and she had a little something to say about the main character. At the time, she'd thought she was too negative all the time. Her attitude to life wasn't consistent with the change she'd made throughout the story. She chose to complain rather than work. That's what she felt after reading through the script. She found it hard understanding her emotions. But when she told the rest of the group this, they laughed. Yeonjae asked if she'd ever experienced a setback that she couldn't overcome, and she was thrown off by the suddenness of his question. Honestly, she really hadn't. At the time, of course. He thought it made sense that she couldn't relate with the character because she'd been able to overcome every challenge she'd encountered. She was flushed with embarrassment and quickly jumped in to explain that she didn't think the character was pathetic. She could understand her struggles, but they just didn't get to her on a deeper level. She was worried she wouldn't portray her well if she tried, but Yeonjae thought otherwise. He thought she could do it, believed in her despite her doubts. He added that she was so good that even though she hated a script, she'd always slip into character once the time came, so easily. Another colleague thought she worried too much. Yeonjae cheerily declared she was born to act. One colleague asked her to remember the group when she got famous, while another wanted autographs while they still could. It was all overwhelming, and she remembered asking them to quit flattering her. The group had burst into laughter afterwards. Yeah, she couldn't have possibly known back then that the good days had an expiry date. In the present, she stood in front of a life-sized photo of myself. Behind her, she could hear the remarks of a couple who'd come to see the photos in the gallery. The lady thought she looked pretty and wanted to know who she was. She called Myeong captivating, while her husband thought she was totally worthy of being Eunmil's muse. It felt like they were speaking of someone she didn't know. She couldn't be any of those things they just said, right? It was strange how she was the one in the photos and still not the one at the same time. The photos showed a picture of someone who was very determined. Myeong could understand where she might have gotten all that confidence from. But sadly, it was all gone. All of it. She looked at the photos one last time, sad nostalgia in her eyes, and she could only wonder, how had she changed so much? And who on earth was Eunmil, the photographer who'd captured this woman she'd forgotten about? Life had to continue afterwards. After the rain, Myeong had to report to the home where her services had been booked. The client wasn't pleased at all. Myeong was late. The client didn't think she looked capable of doing the job either. Myeong quickly explained, with her eyes on the floor the whole time, that she'd been caught in the rain on her way. The client found her excuse very flimsy, but let it go. For the first and only time, however. Even moments after she'd been at the exhibition, seeing the photos for herself, it still didn't feel real to Myeong. She quickly thanked the client and went into the house to get started on her job. Myeong felt like she'd lost all of herself. As she put on the apron and held her hair back to get started, she thought back to her life at 20, the lady in the photos. Which one was the real her? At the end of the day, Myeong returned to her apartment. Yeonjae was in the bedroom. She asked if he was sleeping, and he answered in the affirmative. Myeong asked him if it wasn't too early to go to bed, but he had no reply for her question. She told him they had to talk, but he turned away from her and said he had to leave very early the following day. Myeong recalled he'd mentioned the shoot was the next day. She quietly sat on the bed, a question dancing on her lips. And she eventually asked. Myeong asked Yeonjae if he loved her. He was both surprised by the randomness of her question and not ready to answer at the same time. He had to sleep. Myeong was too tired and frustrated to press further. She simply flopped on the bed and began whispering to herself. Did she still love her boyfriend? She closed her eyes and let the sleep claim her after a very long day. That night, for the first time in a while, she dreamt about her and Yeonjae. They'd just begun dating in the dream, and she'd asked him the same question, if he loved her. Yeonjae quickly answered and said that he did. Myeong jokingly asked how much, and he told her he loved her so much, while planting a kiss on her hand. Then she asked him why he loved her, and Yeonjae smiled while he thought about the answer. He answered with a hint of uncertainty in his voice and said it was probably because she was beautiful when she smiled. Myeong quickly teased him with a playful poke on the cheek and asked if he thought she wasn't beautiful when she wasn't smiling. They laughed for a while. And then things got serious. Yeonjae leaned in closer, his bespectacled eyes digging deep into hers as he answered and said that she wasn't beautiful. Myeong quickly pulled away in shock. Yeonjae sat up in bed as well and said she wasn't always that way. She'd changed so much. She'd become so negative, so moody, and dark. He liked her when she used to shine bright. He didn't think she was lovable anymore. Myeong's eyes quickly darted open. It had been a terrible dream. The space beside her was empty. Yeonjae walked in almost immediately and apologized for waking her up. Myeong asked him if he had to leave right away, and he said he did because it was a long trip out of the city, and he wasn't going to be home for a couple of days. Myeong sadly mused over his announcement before asking if Yana was going to be with him. Hyunjae was surprised that she'd bring Yana up out of nowhere. He let out a sigh and said he was going to work. He stepped out of the house and promised to call when he had the time. Myeong was frustrated as he shut the door behind him. They were only together on the surface, but their true feelings were buried away. Myeong reasoned that if she bluntly asked Hyunjae to say what feelings he was hiding from her, their relationship would collapse. Suddenly, it occurred to her that she was pursuing acting for the same reason. She wondered if she should remain on the same path. Maybe she should have quit a long time ago. Maybe she should have let both the relationship and her acting career go. Her phone beeped with an email. Myeong wondered if it was more spam mail. It was from a sender named Metaphor Entertainment. Somehow, they'd seen her photos from the exhibition. Myeong immediately became focused on the email. And since Eunmil never knew her name, he'd tagged her Muse Light, so the email was addressed to this alias. They were endlessly captivated by her charm and really wanted to see her in person. Myeong couldn't believe her eyes. Metaphor Entertainment managed some of the biggest actors in the country, including Yenaban. All Myeong Yu knew about Eunmil was that he never interacted with his subjects directly. He just took random photos of people in public and asked them for permission later on to display the photos for exhibitions. He loved to make the photos grayscale, and no matter what their reality was, his subjects always seemed to lead romantic lives. As time passed, everyone on the streets hoped to be captured by Eunmil's camera. Even though his method of photography could have been heavily criticized, he was good at his job, and so the public loved his work. That was how Eunmil became a photographer who gave hope and meaning to people's lives. And coincidentally, the subject of his first ever colored series of photos and the last model of his career was none other than Myeong. The world was buzzing with a new obsession. They wanted to know who Eunmil's muse was. They wanted to know Myeong Yu. No one had ever seen her. Myeong read through yet another blog asking questions about her identity, a smoke piece in her mouth. And as she observed the frenzy around her secret identity, she realized how insignificant she'd been. Myeong went to meet with the director of Metaphor Entertainment, Il-ha-baek. The lady welcomed her with a smile and an outstretched hand to shake hers, and she wasn't alone. The manager, Yoo-hun-yoon, introduced himself as well. He held Myeong's gaze until she became self-conscious and wondered why he was staring at her. She said a nervous hello to them and introduced herself. The director asked her to sit at the table with them. Then she began by saying it was an honor to meet someone as famous as Myeong in person. She expressed her confidence in Myeong to grow even more impressive. Myeong was flustered that the director had called her famous, but she thanked her anyway. Then she asked how she found out her identity, because she'd thought no one knew she was Muse Light. Il-ha said she could tell right away, and wondered why other people couldn't recognize her. She went on to tell Myeong that she'd made an impression on her in one of her movies. Myeong was surprised that the lady remembered her role in the movie because it had been a very small one. She felt grateful to the lady. Il-ha smiled at her before setting her cup of tea on the plate. She asked Myeong what her relationship was with Eunmil. Myeong was caught off guard by the question. And of course, she didn't really have an answer immediately. She had to tell the truth and admitted that she had never really met Eunmil before, nor did she give him her permission to exhibit her photos. It was still scary that he'd taken the photos of her from 10 years ago, and she still didn't have the appropriate response. She asked the lady if she had any advice for her. Il-ha was surprised that he didn't have the permission to take the photos. She'd heard that was Eunmil's process, but taking photos without consent was a crime in her opinion. She slammed her fist on the table and declared it was unacceptable. She suggested Myeong could try getting the photos down through a lawsuit, but she added that the results were never guaranteed to end well. Plus, Eunmil was dead, and getting an apology from him was practically impossible. She let out a sigh and wondered how the situation with the photos could have happened. The table was silent for a moment before Il-ha spoke again. She said that if Myeong thought about the whole situation differently, she'd see she was getting more attention than she'd ever gotten. Myeong was shocked by the realization. Il-ha continued. This was an opportunity for Myeong. She could already picture the big reveal. Muse Light was actually the actress Myeong Yu. She thought it sounded nice, and the photos had a certain charm to them. Then she continued and told Myeong that before an artist became an artist, before Myeong Yu became an actor herself, she had a certain naivete she could never return to. The photos could become a part of her history. If only Myeong would say she acted as Eunmil's muse, it'd cover her private life too. So she asked Myeong if she wanted to take the photos down, pretend like they never happened, and carry on living her life as it was. Or would she take the other route, be a celebrated artist's muse and become a star? It was all her choice to make in the end. Myeong sat in silence for a while before admitting she wasn't certain about everything, because it felt like lying to the public. Il-ha quickly told her to think of it as acting. Myeong went silent again, and Ilha asked her to give the offer a thought and call when she'd made up her mind. She was sure the decision wouldn't be difficult. With that, she rose to her feet, told Myeong how it had been a pleasure to see her before walking away, her heels clacking away with every step. Myeong remembered a question she had and called out to the pair before they could disappear. Myeong asked if they knew what happened to Eunmil. She'd heard he was young. Yoo-hun, the producer, answered by saying that an early death usually meant one thing. Eunmil had taken his own life. Myeong stared in stunned silence, almost immediately regretting she'd asked. At home, Myeong perched on a chair by her reading table and did her own research on Eunmil. She'd become quite obsessed. Blogs said he'd died of a heart attack and not suicide. That detail stood out for Myeong. It had been 3 days since she'd met with the guys from Metaphor Entertainment. And boy, had she been thinking about their offer. Being an artist's muse sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But Myeong didn't feel comfortable with the idea, and she hesitated to make a decision. Myeong leaned back in the chair and let out an exasperated shout. She'd never been more uncertain with the decision before. She could only wonder why Eunmil had to take a stranger's photo in the first place. She figured she'd ask Hyunjae's opinion, but then she also realized she'd not heard from her boyfriend yet. She wondered when he was going to return home. Even though he'd been acting coldly, she still missed him, and that could only mean that she was still in love with her boyfriend. She looked at her phone wallpaper. She had a feeling inside her that everything would just work out. Almost as if on cue, Hyunjae called Myeong. She heaved a sigh of relief before answering it. She said her hi and her boyfriend apologized for taking a while to call her. Myeong told him it was okay and asked when he was returning. Hyunjae said he was returning the following day. Myeong echoed her acknowledgement, and the both of them went silent for a while. Then, out of nowhere, Hyunjae told Myeong that he missed her. Myeong was shocked, and of course her cheeks grew pink with a blush immediately. Hyunjae asked if she missed him as well, and she admitted that she did. His lips curled up in a satisfied smirk, and he promised to return early the following day so they'd grab something good to eat. He said his goodbye to her, and just as he was going to say that he loved his girlfriend, Yena showed up from around the corner, expressing her delight at seeing him. He turned around and ended the call while asking Yena what the matter was. Yena offered him a silly smile and said she just showed up for no reason at all. Meanwhile, back home, Myeong was getting worked up over hearing Yenaban's voice while she was talking with her boyfriend. They'd been having a moment for crying out loud. Yena asked Hyunjae if they could grab a drink together the following day. Hyunjae was stunned by her request and asked why he'd want to go out with her. Yena sighed and revealed that she was going through a rough patch. Hyunjae looked at her with skeptical eyes and said she was doing great. Yena told him she'd almost fallen over from a panic attack while on set. She also revealed that simple monologue scenes were difficult for her. Yena said she'd seen all the short movies Hyunjae and Myeong had made together. Hyunjae quickly jumped in to say that the early films had been just for practice. Yena persisted. She asked him for some advice because she believed he had a lot of experience, practice videos or not. Then she looked at him with teary eyes and said he was the only one she could turn to. Hyunjae observed briefly before finally conceding to her request. He told her that he had until 7 p.m. because he had to get back early the following day. Yena was delighted and agreed to his terms with a smile. They could have fun chatting until then. The following day, they went for a drink like Hyunjae had promised. Hyunjae admitted that the place wasn't so bad, minus the cost, of course. Yena agreed with him and said she came to the place frequently because it had a quiet and nice vibe. Out of nowhere, Yena stuck out her phone and asked Hyunjae if he'd seen the photos from the exhibit. She had a photo of Hyunjae and Myeong together on the screen. He looked surprised to see Myeong in the photos, and Yena seemed pleased that he was finding out from her. She explained that the photo was from the exhibition that everyone was talking about. Hyunjae still found it all overwhelming to understand. Yena admitted that Myeong was beautiful back in the day. She was unrecognizable, so it was most likely her freshman year in college, around the time he'd started falling in love with her. Hyunjae revealed that she'd had a boyfriend back then, so he'd only just admired her. Yena told him how she thought he was so sensitive and pure-hearted. Hyunjae laughed, but deep in his mind, he wondered just when Myeong had taken the photos. Yena kept stealing glances at Hyunjae, who was in a world of his own. She emptied her glass and dropped it down to the table with a loud clink. That caught his attention. Yena began speaking. She was motivated by her drink at this point, and Hyunjae could tell, because she began coming too close for comfort. She asked him if he still felt the same way about Myeong Yu as he felt for her back then. Hyunjae became sweaty and nervous, stuttering as he tried to speak. You see, a few hours earlier, back home, Myeong had launched into a spring cleaning spree in preparation for her boyfriend's return. Their relationship had hit its lowest only a few days ago, but Hyunjae's trip had reignited that spark they'd lost. and put a pause to the fighting that had become a recent habit. Thanks to the new spark, she'd spent most of the morning running about with excitement. Myeong really brought her best to bear while cleaning the house. She cleaned places for a living after all. Myeong listed off all the things she had left to do after fixing the bedroom. She still had to mop and get groceries and then do the laundry. But as she glanced in the direction of the laundry in the corner, she recalled it had been bothering for a few days. She picked up a piece of clothing, sat on the bed, and held it up to her nose. She breathed in Hyunjae's scent and his name escaped her lips. It reminded her of something she'd forgotten about. She threw the cloth on her body and fell back on the bed. Then she realized in that moment that maybe she didn't have to be a celebrated artist's muse. What really was the point of fussing and rushing to make a decision? She picked up an old manuscript and her mind traveled back to a time in the past. Hyunjae had given her the script which he'd written himself, and she'd been so impressed. They'd sat under a tree in fall, and the grass around them was littered with leaves from the tree, which hadn't stopped falling. She thought it was so good, she read the whole thing in one sitting. The main character's melancholy fascinated her. Hyunjae, being modest, blushed at her praise and thanked her. But Myeong insisted she was serious. She loved his writing. It was tender, yet tinged with loneliness. She'd been finding it difficult to access her innermost emotions since the previous year, but reading the script had helped her to understand things a little better. She hoped to try playing the role of the main character in the future. Hyunjae was moved by the vulnerability in her words and asked her if she wanted to keep the script. Myeong quickly explained that she'd not said all those things because she wanted the script, but Hyunjae merely smiled. He told Myeong he'd seen a comic one time, and it had been about this boy and girl who were dreamers. They made each other a promise on the day of their graduation, that the girl would act in the boy's first project, and if their dream were to come true, so would their love. Myeong was amazed by his story, confused, but still pulled in by it. Hyunjae told Myeong that she'd be an actor someday, and he'd be a director. He'd been thinking about their future a lot, how it'd be nice for her to be the star of his first project as a director. And that was why he wanted her to keep the script, not because of her profound words earlier. He'd actually written the script just for her. Myeong was shocked and moved by the gesture. Her eyes watered with tears before she could even think about it. Hyunjae continued speaking, a little smirk on his face as he did so. He said, even though it felt embarrassing to admit, because his next words would really sound so scripted, Myeong was his muse. People only ever saw the happy side of her, but he could sense the melancholy as well. He wanted to capture that with his camera. Myeong had been so moved, she immediately agreed to be his muse. There and then, she made Hyunjae promise that someday when he became a director and she became an actor, they'd turn the script into a movie. Hyunjae blushed in surprise at her willingness to take him up on his wish. Then he added that once they'd achieved their dreams, they'd get married. But Myeong grabbed his face and pulled herself in to claim his lips with hers. She told Hyunjae that they didn't have to wait until their dreams had come true to get married. She really liked and admired him and wanted for them to be together. She asked Hyunjae out. Of course, he was surprised by her straightforwardness, but only initially, though. He settled into the moment, a smile on his face as he thanked Myeong. There, under the tree, in a rain of falling leaves, they promised to love each other. In the present, Myeong fingered the back of the old script, and in her heart, she wondered if she and her boyfriend were truly still the same as they were back when they'd made that promise to love each other. Much later in the day, a taxi dropped off Hyunjae and Yena. She'd clearly had a lot to drink and hung on to Hyunjae. He tried to push her off and asked her to get a hold of herself, but she was too drunk to say anything coherent. He let out a sigh and wondered why no one from the crew was taking their calls. He couldn't take her back home in her current state. He was completely at a loss for what to do. He suddenly heard footsteps behind him, and it startled him. He and Yena couldn't be out on the streets in his neighborhood. There was no other option. He had to take her home. So, Hyunjae dragged Yena all the way to his apartment, hesitant to step inside as he realized he probably should have let Myeong know he wasn't coming home alone. Then, without warning, Yena suddenly spun around, her arms hanging over his neck as she looked at him with dreamy eyes, and said she wished the apartment was theirs. Hyunjae could almost guess what she was going to do next, and he tried to stop her, but it was already too late. Once she was done speaking, Yenaban lifted herself up to plant her lips on Hyunjae's. He was too stunned to react immediately, but things were about to get even worse. Hyunjae sensed another presence and turned his head. And of course, standing there in the hallway was Myeong, a horrified look on her face as she asked the pair what they were doing. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she repeated the question. Myeong tried to describe the feeling in her heart as just betrayal, but it was hardly enough to describe the hurt she felt. She felt three things at once. She felt like she'd been holding Hyunjae back from his full potential. She also realized that their love, bound by a sacred promise, had only been a relationship to him. And lastly, she felt like she'd lost everything to Yenaban. She'd felt pathetic when she'd first felt threatened by her, but it really didn't compare to the feeling of defeat she was experiencing. She asked them what they were doing, with tears in her eyes. Yeonji had been her last source of hope, but that was lost now. Myeong left the building and Hyunjae went out after her. When he caught up with her, he tried to explain things. Myeong caught the alcohol in his breath and asked if he'd been out drinking with Yena. Hyunjae couldn't give a straight answer, but his reaction was more than enough. Myeong said she'd spent the whole day excited about his return, cleaning the apartment and getting ready for him, while he was out drinking and kissing another woman. She felt so pathetic. Hyunji tried to explain in exasperation that the kiss had only just happened and Yena had been drunk. He apologized to Myeong and reminded her that she was the only one for him. Then he added in his defense that they'd been out to discuss the movie, and if the movie did well, he'd be making his directorial debut. Then they'd make that movie they'd promised to each other those years ago. But Myeong was so sick of hearing about the promise. The mere thought of it was stealing the air from her lungs. She shook violently with pain as she asked if it wasn't enough to just love. Why did Hyunjae always have to put success before love? Hyunjae tried to reason with her. She was angry, but he didn't always put success over love. She cut him off mid-sentence. He still didn't get it. She'd changed too much since their promise under that tree in fall. She was a completely different person. She admitted the truth with tears flooding down her face. Now, she couldn't make his dreams come true anymore. Hyunjae remembered Yena's question back at the bar, and his answer as well. The truth was, he'd never stopped loving Myeong. But the reality kept shifting. The promise they'd made to each other when they were younger now felt so overwhelming and impossible, because they'd been so naive back then. But he didn't plan on changing anything, because that promise was what made their relationship special. His answer had thrown Yena into silence, but then she asked if Myeong felt the same way. Hyunjae had been quick to say that Myeong did, but Yena laughed and said he only thought so. He couldn't be so sure. Maybe the promise had felt overwhelming to Myeong. Yena sowed the seed of doubt in Hyunjae's mind with her statement, and he suddenly reasoned it was possible that Myeong felt overwhelmed by their promise. But he still believed in her, and knew they'd both make it someday. That hadn't changed since the very beginning. Yena looked him in the eyes and admitted that he was loyal, but she didn't mind a little challenge. Hyunjae hadn't caught the meaning of her words, and when he asked for clarity, Yena told him that if he loved Myeong so much, he wouldn't be out drinking with her. Hyunjae was shocked. She'd told him she was in a slump, and he'd only agreed to come so it wouldn't affect the shoot. Yena was all smiles as she rhetorically asked if he'd actually fallen for her lie. She'd only needed something to get his attention, because all he ever thought about was movies. And even while Hyunjae was trying to fight for his relationship, Yena sat in the corner, praying for them to break up. How cruel. Hyunjae fell to his knees as Myeong walked away, her heart too heavy to see his reason. They broke up that day. The dream that had made their relationship worth keeping had become like a shackle he'd grown to be obsessed with. Too obsessed, until she became obsolete. Myeong looked at her phone wallpaper, and the idea of a romantic love didn't seem appealing to her anymore. She flung the device to the ground in anger. She'd never imagined she'd break up with Hyunjae for something so trivial. But time had passed since the promise, and they'd both grown into adults with nothing special about them. She looked down at her feet where her phone lay broken and realized that there were no comic book miracles after all. In the end, her broken dreams simply faded away. She had nowhere to go. No friends, no family. Yes, no family. Myeong had nobody. And so, with nowhere to go after walking aimlessly all night, Myeong found herself at the exhibition gallery. She looked up at the life-sized photographs of herself and burst into tears. She'd lost everything and had nowhere else to go, but the gallery felt the most welcoming. She felt a connection to Eunmil, who'd captured her happiness and preserved it in the gallery that felt like a secret. She fell to her knees and cried some more. Then she heard a voice from the corner asking what the matter was and why she was crying in front of such a beautiful photo. Myeong's head instantly flew up, and standing right above her was none other than the producer from Metaphor Entertainment, Yuhan Yoon. With tears in her eyes, Myeong confessed that she wanted to become famous. She wanted to be so loved by everyone in the world, enough to be in their dreams. Yuhan took off his jacket and draped it over Myeong. Then he reminded her that she was loved by a celebrated artist. He held out his hand for her to take and reassured her that her dreams will soon come through. Myeong looked at him hopefully before taking his hands and letting him pull her up. And that was how her life turned around completely. Myeong sat in an interview after her world changed for the better. The interviewer asked how she felt after becoming a worldwide sensation after revealing her identity as Eunmil's muse. The lady remarked that things must have gotten busy for her with all the attention. Myeong was just happy to have caught the interest of so many people, but she had mixed feelings since her friend's death had been the catalyst of her fame. The interviewer quickly pointed out that Myeong had referred to Eunmil as her friend. Eunmil was extremely private when he was alive, and no one knew much about his personal life, so she wanted to know what Myeong's relationship with the late photographer had been. Myeong hesitated before telling her a well-rehearsed lie. They'd been artistic partners who'd inspired each other. Eunmil would often take photos of her, and she liked them because she felt they were more beautiful than she was in person. She'd never imagined that the photos would become so talked about. Then she paused with a smile before adding that she'd been Eunmil's model and a big fan of his work. The interviewer continued with her questions. The photos gave off the feeling of so much love coming from the person behind the lens, so people had begun spreading rumors that Eunmil and Myeong were lovers in his lifetime. Myeong waved it off with a little smile and explained that they'd had a more platonic relationship. Simply an artist and his muse. An artistic relationship, nothing more. The interviewer was surprised by the story. It felt like something out of a movie poetically romantic. Myeong laughed a little and asked if it really did feel like a movie. But deep down, her answer had only disgusted her so much. But she'd had to remind herself that she was only acting. The interviewer suddenly asked about the background of Myeong's story. Myeong instantly recalled what Ilha had instructed her to say if the question ever came up. Ilha had asked her to say that she'd been Eunmil's work partner, and he loved her as his muse. They focused on creating pure art and not chasing fame. She wanted the focus of the story to be on the artistry instead of her private life. Ilha thought it was important what the public thought about an actor, and Myeong agreed. Ilha had then informed her about the interview and slid her a script of what to say and do during the interview. She asked what Myeong thought about the script as she read through it. Myeong wasn't entirely comfortable. What if her lies were later discovered? Ilha quickly explained that Eunmil was already dead, and his private life with him. The remaining facts about him, the photos he'd taken of Myeong, were the new narrative. But Myeong wasn't completely convinced. She really couldn't do an interview telling so many lies. Ilha found it ridiculous that she thought so, and asked her to think of it as acting. Myeong's head flew up in surprise, and Ilha reiterated her point. She asked Myeong if she could do the job, and the latter mused aloud. Ilha didn't continue speaking, and told Myeong that actors didn't just act in films, they also had to act in every moment outside of their lives. And Myeong didn't even have to be an actor to do that anyway, because we were all acting in our daily lives. Ilha admitted that she was, and so was Myeong. She said she was looking forward to seeing Myeong's acting in the future. The interview broke through Myeong's thoughts with her last question. She asked Myeong what kind of actor she would like to become. Myeong was caught off guard by the question. As simple as it was, it had not come up in the script Ilha had given her, and so she hadn't prepared for it. And as expected, Myeong couldn't answer the question right away. Then, as with everything else she'd had the entire interview, she said she wanted to be a pure actor. Of course, it was just another lie. The interviewer asked if she could elaborate on her answer. Myeong answered and said that she'd like to be an actor who didn't care about critics, the box office, or their own public image. Just an actor who stayed true to the roles she played. The words rolled off her tongue like a very pathetic lino, an ad-lib. The issue of Dada magazine was released much later. Ilha held a copy in her office and gushed over how photogenic Myeong looked. She also added that some people never looked good enough in photos, no matter how attractive they were in reality. But her photos always seemed to tell a story. Ilha asked if it was because of her charisma or simply because she was an excellent actor, and laughed. Myeong didn't know how best to respond to the other lady's remarks. Then, out of the blue, Ilha presented the craziest idea ever. She wanted to get Myeong in a drama. She asked if Myeong had ever worked on a drama before. Myeong was still shell-shocked. A drama? Ilha explained that the agency was working on a drama, and she thought Myeong would fit perfectly for a role in it. In fact, she'd already decided that Myeong was going to be in it. She asked if Myeong was going to take the role. Myeong was finding it hard to process what she'd just heard. She hadn't even auditioned for the role. Was it possible to just land it like that? Ilha maintained that she'd insisted for Myeong to be included in the drama. Myeong mused on the news. It was that easy for her to land a role. Ilha mistook her silence for hesitation and said she'd thought Myeong would be happy to learn about the news. Myeong quickly said she was happy and added a thank you. She promised to do her best. Ilha said she'd look forward to seeing the results. Then she added the extra spice to the news. Myeong would be accompanied by Eun, the producer, if she had no problem with it. Myeong agreed, and Ilha said she'd have him send the script over. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Another actor was being chaperoned by his manager. He scrolled through the photos that catapulted Myeong to fame and stopped on one. He found it interesting. He showed it to his manager, who was behind the wheels, and asked if he'd seen the photo. The manager, who also worked for the agency, told the actor that he was going to work with her on a drama. The actor was genuinely surprised, but he knew Metaphor Entertainment. They worked really fast. He looked at Myeong's photo with a mischievous smile and remarked that it had been a while. Meanwhile, elsewhere in a new apartment, Yoon and Myeong had just arrived and were settling down to some steaming hot tea. Yoon asked Myeong if she liked the place, and she answered in the affirmative. She also confessed that she'd not expected the accommodation arrangements to be so nice and expressed her gratitude. Yoon explained that as one of the studio's new actors, she had to be taken care of. He was also glad she liked the house. Afterwards, he handed her the script. The story was about a romantic affair between a wealthy man and an ordinary girl. Myeong was going to play the man's first love. She let the words roll against her tongue. Yoon quickly jumped in to explain that even though it wasn't the main role, it had the potential to stand out even more. And that was why Ilha had chosen it for her. Realizing how much pressure she was under, Myeong let out a nervous laugh and said she'd better give the role her best shot. Yoon calmly reaffirmed their confidence in her. Myeong asked him if the actor she'd be working with had been cast yet, and he said she had. Her name was Lily, a popular idol, and she was the female lead. Myeong wondered aloud about the actor's idol status, while Yoon explained that it had been the co-producer's decision to include her for the global appeal of the drama. Yoon had been a bit worried himself at the decision, but Lily did well while auditioning for the role and cleared his doubts. Then he added that the male lead was an actor from the agency as well, so there was no need to worry about the drama's quality. Myeong was surprised that the male lead was an actor from Metaphor. Then, Yoon dropped his name like a bombshell. Haido Kang. Myeong was now even more shocked than she'd been earlier. Yoon casually said he knew they had a bit of history. Somewhere else in the city. Hyunjae drowned himself in more bottles of alcohol than he'd done in his whole life. The apartment was littered with it, and it didn't seem to be enough, because he drank even more. The doorbell rang for a while before he finally brought himself to go get it. He asked who it was before realizing it was only Yenaban. She cheerily asked him if he'd been expecting someone else because he seemed disappointed. She asked him if she could come in, and he stepped out of the way for her. Yena took a glance around the place, her eyes following the trail of bottles lying around everywhere. Then, out of nowhere, she asked Hyunjae if he was still mad at her. She'd noticed he'd been cold to her while they were shooting. Hyunjae stopped abruptly and asked her what she wanted. Yena said he'd only proved her right by asking that question right after she walked into the place. Then she offered an apology for what had happened and asked if Hyunjae and Myeong had broken up because of her. The nerve of this girl. Hyunjae let out a sigh and said that was besides the point. Yena didn't stop. She said it must be hard for him, because he'd been with Myeong for 8 years. At this point, Hyunjae got tired of her charade and turned to ask what she'd actually come for. Yena slipped into character, fidgeting with her cap in her hands as she explained that she'd just come to check on her assistant director because he seemed down lately. And she blamed herself for it, because of the kiss. Hyunjae looked away immediately and asked her to forget about it. She'd been drunk and made a mistake. But Yena closed the gap between them without warning and threw her arms around him. She asked him why he chose to pretend like he didn't know it had been no accident. Hyunjae forcefully yanked her arms off his body and asked her to let go of him. He spun around and asked her to stop her little act because he wasn't into her like that. All they had was a professional relationship, period. Yena was shocked and admitted that he was probably the only man who wasn't attracted to her, especially after seeing her first ever movie. Hyunjae slammed his palm on his head in exasperation and told her it was only a movie. Yena asked him if it was easy for him to distinguish the actor from the role, because even actors had a hard time doing so. An awkward silence passed between them before Yena asked if Hyunjae still had feelings for Myeong. He kept silent and she had her answer. She turned around in defeat, hung her cap over her head and announced that she was leaving. You'd think she was done at this point. But Yena paused at the door, her head held low as she announced to Hyunjae the actor whom Myeong would be shooting the drama with, Haido Kang. Hyunjae was shocked to hear that name. Then, like a rapper leaving his last punchline, Yena asked if he thought Myeong would be able to distinguish between the actor and the role because of their shared past. Back at Metaphor Entertainment, the table reading session for the drama was taking place inside a small boardroom. Myeong read out her lines methodically, and by the end of the session, there was a round of applause from the director who expressed his delight in their delivery. Afterwards, Eun walked Myeong out of the building. He figured she must be tired, and since she had nothing scheduled for after the session, she could go get some rest. But while he was still speaking, he got interrupted by someone who called out pretty loudly to Myeong. It was none other than Haido Kang, and he announced his presence with a heavy hug from behind Myeong. He told her he'd missed her and spun her around to take a good look at her. He pulled in close, very uncomfortably so for Myeong, and announced that it was good to see her after so long. She'd not changed much since they'd last met. Haedo joked about how his words sounded so like the lines they'd read back at the session earlier. Myeong just wanted him to let go of her. Yoon stepped up immediately and pushed him away, while letting him know he was making Myeong uncomfortable. Haedo offered a half-hearted apology with his hands thrown up in the air in mock surrender. He said he'd been so happy to see her that he went back to his old habits. Then he asked if she had a boyfriend, before asking her to consider grabbing a meal with him sometime in the future. They were shooting a drama together, so Hyunji definitely had to understand it was nothing personal. Myeong kept her eyes to the ground at the mention of Hyunjae's name. Thankfully, Haedo announced that he was headed to his next appointment and waved goodbye. He hadn't changed at all. So much time had passed and he was still so full of himself. And he managed to sweep her off her feet. Myeong thanked Yoon for stopping Haedo. She let out a scoff and said she'd have cussed out a fellow actor if he hadn't stepped in. Yoon suddenly asked what her relationship with Haedo had been, because apparently they seemed to have been more than just college friends. Myeong explained that they'd only dated briefly, and nothing more. She'd been 20 at the time and thought she was in love, swept up by Haedo like waves. She could still remember it like it was yesterday. She'd gone out with a box of smoke pieces one late night. Haedo materialized from nowhere and slipped the one she'd held up to her lips away from her. He asked if she'd heard the rumors about them dating. Myeong was surprised that people would think they were dating, and she really wanted to snatch her smoke piece back from him. He put it on his lips and spat it out almost instantly, wondering aloud how people enjoyed it. He'd not even lit up and it was gross. He became more serious almost immediately and went back to the rumors. Everyone had made their conclusions and thought that he and Myeong looked good together. Myeong quickly asked him to ignore them, but Haedo wasn't done speaking. He confessed that he liked her the best out of all their colleagues. Myeong wondered if that was supposed to be a compliment. Haedo quickly assured her that it was and asked her if she wanted to give dating a shot. Myeong was stunned by the directness of his request. Haedo asked if she didn't think it'd be fun if they got together as the two hottest people in the department. Just like that. So casually, he asked her to be his girlfriend. Myeong was caught unawares. She really didn't think it was going to be fun to date Haedo. In all honesty, the hottest people in the department tag he'd come up with sounded silly to her. But Haedo didn't see that. He believed Myeong liked him. Myeong was even more surprised at his bold assertions. Then, without warning and totally misinterpreting the blush on her cheeks, Haedo leaned in to kiss Myeong. She shut her eyes nervously in anticipation, but the kiss never happened. Haedo buried his head in the space next to Myeong's by the wall and revealed that he'd had a crush on her too. She moved away in shock at the revelation, her face glowing a bright pink with embarrassment. When she was 20 years old, she'd assumed she'd been in love, to be swept by Haedo in waves. Alone at the apartment, Myeong rehearsed her lines for the drama. She read her lines aloud from the script. She asked Haedo's character if he knew why memories were beautiful. The answer was because when you reminisce, you always think of the good parts first. Her character had thought back on them a lot, all their happy moments. So even though their breakup had been a mess, she'd really missed him. A lot. A sigh escaped Myeong's lips as she recited the words. She didn't believe she really had to say those lines to Haedo, even though she was only just acting. She couldn't empathize with the character she was playing? No, she didn't even want to. Why did she have to say the lines from earlier to Haedo of all people? She'd hoped to never see his face again. Ever. Then, as if he was in the room with her, she felt Hyunjae's presence behind her and heard his voice. He said a role was just a role, and she didn't have to worry about people mistaking the characters she played for who she really was. Acting was acting, and she was herself. Myeong sighed sadly. She always heard Hyunjae's voice in her head whenever she read a script, because they'd always read scripts together. Myeong sank to the floor, her back against the wall, as she wondered if she'd really depended so much on Hyunjae. She picked up her old habit of taking smoke pieces. She'd left him because it had become so suffocating and sickening. She'd thought that if she started over in a completely new place, then she'd become a new person. But she'd ultimately realized that maybe she couldn't escape being herself. She was just a continuation of her past, unable to experience any real change. While her thoughts were rolled into a complicated mess, she kept being pushed around by the force of time. Myeong wondered if she'd achieve her dream status as a shining star if she let herself get swept away by the uncertainty. She peeked at her phone. Yenaban was still trending on the blogs as the leading actress. Myeong held the phone up against the backdrop of the sky above and pictured she was holding up a star. Sometime the next day, Lily was recording a video for her followers. She announced she was going to be shooting alongside Haedo Kang later that day, and she was really excited. She confessed that when she'd first seen him, she couldn't really talk to him. She vowed to her followers to make sure she becomes friends with him. Then she added that she also saw the artist's muse as well, Myeong Yu, and she thought she was really gorgeous. She'd sat right next to her and couldn't even look at her. Lily thought everyone on the set was so cool and beautiful and wondered if she could do a good job. Then she quickly switched to some words of affirmation and declared that she could do the job by being brave and giving it her best shot. Shortly after, at the shoot, while they were filming a scene with Lily and Haedo, the director screamed, "Cut!" and asked them to go again. Apparently, he wasn't feeling Lily's performance. Take after take, he kept screaming for them to cut and retake the scene. After one last call, he asked the crew to take a break. Lily began to cry in apology. She blamed herself for the setback in the shoot. She'd just confirmed her biggest fears. She wasn't supposed to be an actor. Haedo patted her on the back and tried consoling her. He told her he'd been a talking potato on his first shoot. Lily looked up at him in disbelief. Haedo Kang was trying to console her? She immediately launched into a series of apologies and self-blaming, but Haedo cut her off and told her she was doing great. He believed she'd do even better when they tried the shoot again. Lily was surprised by his faith in her, but Haedo maintained his belief in her. Lily thanked him with a dramatic bow, and her eyes went wide in surprise when she lifted her head up. Haedo held out a lollipop to her and asked her to relax and take a break. Lily stared at him as he walked away, her eyes wide in admiration, and she promised to take his advice. Then she told him to enjoy his break as well. Then, somewhere in her head, she began a little apology to her followers. Someone had just stolen her heart. Meanwhile, the following day, Myeong was on set with her producer by her side. Haedo came up to them, said hi to her, and told her about the coffee truck in the corner. He also offered her a cup of coffee. Myeong hadn't expected the gesture, so she offered him a hesitant thanks before accepting it. She couldn't drink the coffee. Haedo took a break from sipping his and suddenly asked if she could remember their first kiss. Myeong was alarmed by his question and asked why he was bringing it up. Yoon calmly excused himself and left. In his absence, Myeong answered Haedo's question with a hint of uncertainty. The kiss had been bittersweet. Haedo jokingly pointed out that she'd drunk fruit soju at the time. Then he asked her if she still used the smoke pieces. He was about to say something about when he'd kiss her, but she turned away and cut him short by saying she didn't think they'd be friendly enough in the drama post-breakup for such conversations. Haedo momentarily gave it thought, and Myeong wondered what he meant to imply. Shortly after thinking, Haedo turned back to her and said they'd have to figure things out because they had a kissing scene. Myeong didn't remember a kissing scene. Haedo explained that he'd heard about it from the writer. Then he asked her if it didn't excite her that their scenes were playing out just like before. Haedo suddenly went sober and apologized for his past actions, adding a generous bow of his tall frame for good measure. The gesture surprised Myeong, but she quickly recovered and told him that if he was apologizing for the drama that had followed their breakup, then there was no need. She wasn't going to let her personal feelings get in the way of the job. Haedo quickly explained that it wasn't just because of the breakup, but he just wanted to be friends with her again, but just as actors and nothing more. Myeong mused on his words in silence. Haedo asked her if she was still mad at him, and if it'd require him going on his knees to plead. Myeong still found it hard to believe his actions. It didn't seem like he still had any feelings for her. There was zero baggage, almost like they'd never even been together at all. Now she felt like the only one still hung up on her past with Haedo. She'd been silent the whole time, so Haedo called out to her and said he was really going to get on his knees. Then Myeong grabbed him close with her arm, a forced smile on her face as she said she was letting the past go. It was all in the past after all. Haedo's eyes lit up with their usual charm and he thanked Myeong. Then he put his arm around her shoulder and said they'd have to have smiles on their faces the next time they saw each other. Myeong easily agreed but couldn't wait for him to get his arm off her. Then she flashed him a glance and he seemed to notice her discomfort. He apologized and took his arm off. Myeong realized that Haedo had only brought up the past because he didn't want it affecting her acting. He'd always been like that. Haedo waved her goodbye and began walking away. Myeong had never really been able to read his mind, but she knew how serious he was about acting. That's why he was so successful. Myeong recalled her little whining from the previous day at the apartment, and she felt embarrassed by the memory. She was even more embarrassed by the fact that she'd just pretended like she'd gotten over the past too. Haedo Kang was one of the country's most famous actors, while Myeong was just... Lily broke through her line of thoughts by calling out her name. Her head bowed. Myeong said hi to the younger lady. Lily noticed she had some coffee with her, and Myeong thanked her for making it available. Lily waved it off modestly and asked if she'd like to have lunch together. Myeong wasn't prepared for her offer, but Lily insisted they leave right away. They went to a sandwich stand instead, and Lily confessed that she'd been looking forward to having lunch with Myeong. Lily handed her a sandwich and asked for them to go to a restaurant the next time. Myeong read the little tag on the sandwich wrap asking her to please take care of Lily. She offered a slightly confused "thank you," while Lily told her that she could speak casually with her, because she really wanted to be friends with her. Myeong was skeptical of her motive, but that didn't chip away at Lily's enthusiasm. Lily said she'd enjoyed Myeong's exhibition, and then she'd watched a movie she'd starred in and became a total fan. Myeong was embarrassed by Lily's high praise for her, and she quickly explained that she'd barely been in the movie, so there was nothing much of her to see in it. Myeong wondered if she was being apprehensive. How could Lily have become a fan just by watching a few scenes of her in a minor role? Situations like the one she found herself in always made her uncomfortable. Lily continued with her trumpet blowing. She didn't think Myeong's minor role was unimportant. She believed that even if Myeong had been in a movie only for a short time, what mattered the most was the acting. Myeong couldn't believe her ears. This kid was actually being serious. Lily confessed that Myeong's role in the movie had helped her with her own acting, and that it was an honor to act alongside a senior colleague she'd watched before in a movie. Then she grabbed Myeong's hands and asked for her to drop the formalities with her, because she really wanted to take the opportunity to get close with her. Myeong noticed that Lily's hands felt small and delicate in hers, and as the younger lady gave her a gentle squeeze, she found herself agreeing to be friends with her. Her hands felt warm and strong despite their size. Myeong realized she'd probably not been clear enough with her last response, and so she rephrased her words and added a thanks to Lily. Lily quickly asked her to call her Lee-soo. Her real name was Lee-soo Lee. She grabbed her own sandwich and suggested for their pair to go and grab a seat. Myeong agreed and Lily led the way. In that moment, Myeong suddenly realized why Lily was so loved by everyone. She finally accepted that both Haido Kang and Lee-soo Lee were true pros. While she was struggling at the bottom, they'd been on the job for a long time. Now, she'd found some luck and was able to work with the both of them on the same set, and as a senior colleague. But to her, they were still worlds apart. Myeong wondered just when she'd be able to catch up with them. How long was her streak of luck going to last? Lily suddenly turned around and said she'd noticed that Myeong and Haido had been together a lot, and they seemed pretty close. Myeong was surprised that Lily had noticed it all. Lily asked what her relationship with Haido was, and Myeong stared at her young colleague blankly, short of the right words to say. She mused in her head what her response would be if she were to open her mouth. She'd dated Haido Kang. But that felt too revealing, for goodness sake. Then, Myeong made up her mind what to say. She told Lily that she'd just been friends with Haido in college. Lily was surprised to learn that they'd gone to the same college, and found it cool too. Then she revealed that she didn't go to college, so she had respect for people who went to school together. Myeong immediately understood how she could feel that way. But she explained that knowing each other could make things feel even more difficult, just like with her Haido. Lily asked if Myeong and Haido weren't close like she'd assumed, because it had really looked like they were close and she'd wondered if they were dating. Then Lily caught herself immediately and apologized for prying into Myeong's private life. Myeong waved it off as nothing and cleared the assumptions about her dating Haido. Lily sounded really excited to learn this. But Myeong quickly added that although Haido was a good actor, he wouldn't make a good boyfriend. Lily's excitement dropped instantly, and she asked how that was so. She thought Haido seemed really sweet. Myeong the young lady briefly before asking if she liked Haido. Lily gasped in shock and began looking around, her face red with embarrassment. Then she leaned in close, her voice dropping into a whisper as she asked Myeong to promise not to share her secret with anyone. She liked Haido. Myeong thought she looked really cute in her vulnerable state. Then she asked Lily how old she was, and she answered that she was 20. Myeong mused aloud over Lily's age. She jokingly said that Haido must seem like a middle-aged man to her. Lily didn't think he was middle-aged. He was cool. But she wanted to know what Myeong had meant when she said Haido wasn't boyfriend material. She asked if he'd been popular in college. Had he been a player? Myeong laughed and said he'd not been anything of the sort. She wanted to tell Lily that Haido just wasn't capable of loving another person. But Lily was too delusional. She'd heard just what she wanted, and she heaved a sigh of relief as she reasoned that it wasn't enough that Haido wasn't a cheat. Myeong was surprised as she realized something. Lee-soo Lee was just like a teen girl who'd fallen head over heels with her big heart and wide eyes. She thought it was nice that she'd held onto her innocence even with her high status in the industry. At her age, she was still so young. She wondered if she'd been the same way at that age. Myeong flashed a smirk and remarked how their little hangout was nice, and how it felt much like her college days with the way they were both talking about relationships and all. Lily asked if she had a boyfriend. Myeong smiled and said she didn't, and Lily quickly asked if there was anyone she liked at least. Myeong maintained that she didn't think so. Lily said she hoped she'd find someone soon. Then she excitedly wished Myeong would find love soon. Myeong concluded that the lady was really an idol among celebrities, an idol among idols. She was so full of life. Myeong said a thank you to Lily. Elsewhere, Hayato got in the car with his manager, who commended him for his work on set that day before asking if he wanted to head home straight away. Hayato said he wanted to go to the practice room instead. The manager turned around to look at him in the back seat and asked why he wanted to do that, since the drama's first episode was airing that day. He asked if Hayato didn't want to watch the drama together, but Hayato announced that he'd decided he wasn't going to care about the drama. He asked why they'd decided to include a novice in the cast. She was stressing him out. His manager asked him if Lily hadn't done well at the table read. Hayato quickly cut in and said if Lily was only good at reading, she should have just gone to be a voice actor instead. But idols could act well, so why couldn't she? His manager quickly advised him not to hate on Lily too much, and besides, he had Myeong on set. Hayato's lips curled in a mischievous grin. She was still the same. She couldn't tell a lie. His manager asked what he'd meant. Hayato casually waved it off and said the drama was done for already. So what was his manager going to do? He ended with a mocking laugh. Hayato's manager quickly reminded him that the drama was being produced by the agency, so he had to give it his best shot. And Hayato, his confidence swirling high as usual, said he always did. He asked his manager if he'd ever seen him put up an awful performance. Meanwhile, Yoon brought the car to a stop at the apartment building. He announced that they'd arrived, but when he turned around, he realized Myeong was already asleep. She turned in her sleep and a little laugh escaped her lips. Yoon gave her a little silent stare and reclined in the driver's seat. Myeong finally stirred awake around the same time Eun had turned around to look at her. She immediately slipped into a state of anxiety. She'd been asleep for a while. She apologized and said Yoon should have woken her up. Yoon told her she'd not been asleep for too long, and he'd just reached over to put a coat over her. Myeong suddenly realized the coat draped over her body was Yoon's. A thank you slipped out of her lips. She stepped down from the car and Yoon said he'd see her next time. Myeong took a couple of steps and suddenly stopped as she realized something. She turned around and told Yoon that the first episode of the drama was airing in a couple of hours and asked if he wanted to watch it with her. Yoon joined her and they went into the apartment together. At the doorstep, Myeong paused and thanked Yoon for accompanying her because she really didn't want to be alone in the apartment. Watching the first episode of a drama she was starring in was supposed to be a major achievement, but she didn't have anyone to share the moment with. Then Myeong caught herself immediately. She realized she was dampening the mood with her sad talk, so she invited Yoon into the apartment. Yoon suddenly asked her to call on him. Myeong was caught off guard. What had he meant by his statement? But Yoon hadn't finished speaking earlier. He completed his statement and said she could call on him if she ever felt lonely or needed a shoulder to lean on, because he'd always be by her side. Yoon's words hung in the air, leaving Myeong momentarily stunned. Yoon told her that if she ever felt lonely or sad or needed a shoulder to lean on, he'd always be by her side. Myeong looked up at Yoon and realized just how seen she felt, despite only revealing a very little part of her heart. Myeong looked away, her cheeks staining slightly with a blush as she admitted that his words had been reassuring to hear. She was taken aback by how much she wanted to cry in that moment. It felt strange. Myeong didn't have the time to think about what he'd meant by those words. Myeong walked over to her fridge and stared at the rows of canned drinks sitting inside it. Beers. They were all she had. She asked Yoon if he'd like one, and he declined politely. Myeong immediately agreed with him, reasoning that he had to drive home afterwards. She made a mental note to get juice in the future. Left without much of an option, she set a can of beer for herself on the coffee table and gave Yoon a glass of water for himself. And she suddenly realized just how awkward it felt for just the both of them to be in the house, late in the evening, alone. Then she commented on how awful the ad on the television was, and Yoon agreed with her. A moment of awkward silence passed between them again, and Myeong mechanically sipped from her can of beer. Then she suddenly turned to him and asked him how old he was. Yoon casually told her he was 25. Myeong was surprised. She'd always assumed that he just looked youthful, but he was in fact pretty young. Yoon reasoned aloud that he wasn't much younger than Myeong. Myeong countered him with a little smile and said she felt far removed from when she was his age, and she could tell how embarrassed Yoon was. Then, out of nowhere, Yoon asked her what it felt like for her when she was 25. Myeong was surprised that he was interested in her past, but she recounted it for him anyway. At 25, she'd just graduated from college and spent a year auditioning for roles. She recalled one horrid experience she'd had. This shady interviewer had asked her if she had a boyfriend. Myeong had been thrown off guard. While she was still trying to understand his question, he promised that she'd get the role if she could take all her clothes off. Myeong nervously said she didn't feel comfortable taking her clothes off. And there was this one time she'd gotten cast as a friend, but she'd been so excited to take the role at the time. She'd been with Hyunjae at the time, and when she asked if she'd get a role with a name in the future, he reassured her that she would. Back then, she'd thought she could continue and keep growing, and she'd done almost everything to do so. She'd acted in an indie movie, made a short movie with Hyunjae. It had gone on like that for 1 year, then 2, and then more years passed. But no one knew about her. So, at 25, she'd had no idea that she'd be taking her first steps in the industry in her late 20s. It might not have been so long, but it had been a very tough period for her, and she couldn't see the light at the end of tunnel. Myeong also confessed that she was still so uncertain about the future, but she hoped she'd grow even after the drama. She wanted to be confident to introduce herself as an actor, or better yet, become famous enough to let her reputation do the introduction instead. Myeong caught herself once she realized that she'd just launched into a rave about her aspirations. Yoon merely stared at her in silence, his eyes landing on the can of beer in her hands. Then suddenly, he said that the day was good enough for a toast, and asked her to get him a can of beer. Myeong produced one and then clinked them together in cheers, and her mind traveled back in time with that one gesture. She'd been with Hyunjae at the time, and she'd vowed that one day she'd be on TV, and they'd have a beer together. Hyunjae had asked why she'd chosen a beer of all things, and Myeong said that soju felt a little sad, plus, wine felt reserved for more successful people. But beer? Beer was just right. Hyunjae playfully asked if she was only making all the talk about beer because she was craving beer and chicken. She laughed and admitted he'd caught her. Almost at the same time elsewhere, Hyunjae sat alone in his apartment and opened his own can of beer. He lifted the drink up to his lips. He was seated in front of the television while a show was playing. The show's theme song filled the air in the room. The acting credits flashed across the screen, Haido Kang's face rolling out first. Myeong and Yoon watched the show themselves in her apartment. Lily's face was next. Next was Myeong's. Both Myeong and Yoon sat together in front of the TV, sipping on their drinks while they watched the drama in silence. Myeong realized that she was keeping an old promise, but with someone new. She chewed absent-mindedly at the edge of the beer can. Her promise to Hyunjae had become a longing, buried in her memory. Her dream came true, but not in the way she'd dreamt of. There was always a difference between reality and dreams, but she resolved to continue dreaming of a better future. Meanwhile, the drama had begun airing and the first scene played on the screen. Lee Soo-lee was supposed to be waking up from sleep, but her acting felt awkward and robotic. Myeong stiffened beside Yoon as she realized there was something really off about the scene. It didn't feel right. Was Lily's acting this bad? Myeong wasn't sure about the scene anymore. And while she was still staring at the screen, she heard a thud and looked down to find Manager Yoon's head resting on her lap. She called out to him a couple of times, but he didn't budge. He snored softly, oblivious to the dilemma he'd just thrown her into. Myeong's eyes went wide in surprise. Her mind reeled with a lot of thoughts all at once. A strange man had drunkenly fallen asleep on her lap. She'd never imagined she'd see something like it ever. It felt extremely surreal, but it also made her realize that her manager, Yoon, who always looked so stoic and collected, was only human too. She looked down on his face as he snored softly. But for a second, Myeong wondered if he was only pretending to be drunk, as he grabbed her thigh firmly in his sleep. She gently pried it off and tossed it back to his body, but it dropped to the floor, and for a second, Myeong was sure Yoon would wake up. But he didn't. Myeong figured he wasn't one to hold his liquor, but wondered why he'd asked for a drink in the first place. He'd passed out only after the first few sips from his beer. She tried shaking him awake. Then she tapped him on the side of his face while calling his name. He muttered something very incoherent in his sleep but didn't stir. Then she pinched him. Suddenly, Yoon said he missed someone. Myeong was relieved he was stirring from his sleep, but wondered what he'd meant. Then Yoon said the words again, this time, implying that he'd missed her. Myeong. It couldn't have been her, right? Myeong was shocked. But Yoon was half awake now, a smile on his face as he called out a greeting. Then he slipped back to sleep, leaving Myeong confused. Was this the real Yoon? On the television, Lee Soo-lee's terrible acting was still rolling on the screen, but that was only just one of Myeong's many concerns. What was she going to do about the drama, and her manager? By the following morning, Yoon woke up in alarm, his face washed red in embarrassment as he realized the situation. He launched into a tirade of apologies, and he looked so clueless. Myeong watched her manager and tried to compare the calm and collected version of him she knew to the man she was looking at. She'd seen yet another side of him again. She'd learned a lot about him just from the previous day and the present one only. She held up a cup of coffee and asked why he'd asked to drink if he couldn't handle his liquor. Yoon was drenched in nervous sweat as he mulled on his answer first before speaking. Then he revealed the truth. Myeong had looked so lonely. Her eyes flew wide open as she heard his response. Then she smiled and said she wasn't lonely after all, thanks to his company. She jokingly added that she'd been pretty taken aback by the whole display. Yoon covered his face in embarrassment and apologized yet again. His eyes flew wide in surprise when a piece of clothing landed on his head. Myeong had dropped a small towel on his head and suggested he take a shower so they could go get something to eat to help with his hangover. Yoon was more than willing to oblige as he savored the heat of the water under the shower. Afterwards, Myeong made good on her promise and took him out to eat. While they were eating, she randomly asked him what he was going to do. Yoon gasped in surprise, caught off guard, and immediately panicking he'd done something wrong. Myeong deadpanned and asked him if he didn't remember anything from the previous night. Yoon let his head drop, a hint of worry in his voice as he admitted that he didn't. Myeong found his reaction pretty funny and fancied teasing him some more but stopped herself from doing so. She told him that it wasn't anything he'd done. Yoon's face immediately lit up with a relieved smile. Myeong's lips curled into a smirk as she said he'd not watched the first episode of the drama properly the previous night. Yoon was caught blank-faced, and Myeong handed him her phone to take a look at the drama ratings. The viewers all thought Lily's acting was terrible and believed she was a disaster because she was an idol trying to act. Myeong pointed out that people were not liking the show one bit, as expected, especially with the whole idols and their poor acting thing. Then she asked him if the drama was going to survive all the negative reviews. Yoon went with her concerns to the director, Ilha, and she didn't see any reason for alarm. Yoon said he was worried that the reviews would have a negative effect on the drama. From all obvious indications, an idol wasn't supposed to be on set of the drama. Then he asked if she'd seen the ratings. But Ilha was seeing things a bit differently. The ratings were at their highest ever. Bad publicity was still publicity, in her opinion. She also thought it was a good thing. After all, ratings were more important than quality. Her only problem was that Lily was getting all the attention instead of the agency's actors. But it didn't matter anyway. Everything was playing to their favor. The idol would take the fall while they prepared for the spotlight. Meanwhile, Lily was in a state of depression as she read through the harsh reviews. The previous night, she couldn't do anything but watch her shortcomings broadcast to the entire nation. It felt like everyone everywhere was digging into her imperfections, pointing accusatory fingers at her, and of course she knew they were still at it. Lily felt inadequate. Her manager peeked into the room and announced that it was time to leave. She had no courage or strength left in her. Nothing. A stray tear rolled down Lily's cheek, but she wiped it away as she told her manager that she was coming. But she still had to get up on the stage and dance with the brightest smile she could afford. How sad. Lily's mind went back in time. After her performance one time, she'd received a shocking revelation. Her bandmate Idris had been disbanded and she was going to go solo. Lily asked about the other girls, and the director told her they'd decided to go their separate ways. All their contracts had been terminated. Lily was in a state of shock. How was any of it possible? How was she the only one left? She couldn't sing like her old bandmate Seora, and she couldn't dance half as well as Harin. She wasn't anything like Chaewon either, who other members could rely on. She'd just been lucky the whole time, and that's how she'd been the only one to survive. At times, she'd felt the struggles of performing solo, the near falls and worried gasps from the fans in the stands. But then, she'd recover just in time and the show would continue. She couldn't show that she was struggling. The reason she could stand on the stage by herself was because she'd had to step over the other girls to get there. So, by being the only survivor, she'd felt relief, guilt, and anxiety, knowing that she could be sent packing like the other girls, and then she'd disappear. Lily had no idea what made her better than the others, and she equally had no idea why people loved her. The only thing she knew was that she had to work hard to survive. But then surviving was hard enough, and that was when her manager had mentioned acting to her. Lily had been shocked by the suggestion at the time. Then her manager told her the role was the leading role in a drama and asked who knew how long she could last as an idol. He reasoned that she could use the drama to build acting experience so she could make the switch eventually. But Lily couldn't stop wondering how absurd and impossible it sounded that she'd be acting. She doubted her ability. As part of her training as an idol, she'd been trained to act, but she'd assumed it was just for the stage. Because life was already difficult for her as an idol. She didn't achieve all she'd achieved by talent. She just got lucky, so she had to work harder. And that was why she tried so hard. But if acting didn't work, if she'd come to a place where her hard work didn't count, what was she going to do? After the disastrous airing of the first episode, Lily became more withdrawn and did even worse. The director kept cutting her off in the middle of her scenes because she was doing so poorly, and Lily had an ocean of apologies to offer. But with every retake, the director was losing his patience. There and then, Lily decided she'd done just about enough. She crouched down on the floor, her head between her legs. She was giving up. Everyone was surprised. Myeong looked down at her junior colleague with concern in her eyes. The director quickly jumped in and said she just had to manage through the rest of the scene since they were almost done. But Lily was done. The director was thrown into a dilemma, and after a while, he announced that they'd be going on a break. The air was electric with murmurs from the crew on set. Myeong crouched beside Lily and asked if she was okay. Haido cursed in frustration and said they had a princess on their hands. Myeong looked up at him in surprise. Why would he say that to the poor girl? But Haido didn't care. He told Lily that if she was going to carry on with her princess act, it'd be best she just quit. Was she aware how many actors wanted what she had? She'd taken a role so many others worked hard to get, and here she was whining over a couple of mean comments. Myeong quickly jumped to Lily's defense and called Haido out for being too harsh. But Haido asked her if she'd forgotten something. People like Lily were the reason she'd remained an unknown actor all those years. Myeong was thrown into silence by his reasoning. Haido looked down at Lily and continued his rebuke. Because studios wanted the ratings, they'd pick famous people as the lead characters and shoot a silly school play. What a waste of film. Haido wasn't pleased at all. And without saying another word, Haido walked away from the two ladies. He didn't even spare them a parting glance. Myeong watched in silence as he walked away, and it hit her. Sometime in the past, she might have made the same comments Haido had just made. But something about his words had made her realize something. No one cared about her acting skills. She didn't even have to audition because she was an artist's muse. She turned back to Lily and asked her not to take Haido's words too personally because he took acting very seriously and could be very intense. As she looked at Lily, Myeong wondered if she could honestly say that she'd tried harder than the poor girl. Lily whispered her gratitude to Myeong and slowly rose to her feet. Then she declared that she wasn't going to quit. Ever. She wanted to become as good as her seniors. She'd made sacrifices to be where she was, so she was obligated to do a good job to avoid being put to shame. Then Lily made a big confession. Things weren't going the way she wanted because every time she stood before a camera, she froze up. She begged her senior colleagues for help. She couldn't lose everything just like that. Disappear like the other girls from her former band. And then, with tears pouring down her face, she said she just wanted to survive. Haido had paused somewhere in the middle of Lily's outburst, but still had his back facing her. So when she said she wanted to survive, he asked if she'd just said those words. And then he slid his glasses off his face before looking over his shoulder to ask her what she wanted him to do about her wish. She could figure it out on her own. How did she want to be as good as him in the industry when she was only acting her first role? That was a very shameless request to make as far as he was concerned. She didn't even have the talent to pull off her little sob act. Myeong stared in disbelief, feeling the harshness of Haido's words. They still had to finish the shoot after the break, but she doubted they'd have any luck with the way he was going. Haido's manager appealed to him to stop, and he nonchalantly waved off the situation as he continued walking away. Myeong turned to look at Lily. The poor girl had to hear all she'd just heard from her crush. How crushed her spirit must have been afterwards. Myeong wondered if she was going to be okay. Then suddenly, Lily declared that she was indeed shameless. Myeong stared at her, surprised at her sudden admittance. But Lily wasn't done. She said she sucked at acting, but she had a pretty face and a lot of fans. So, yes, she was arrogantly trying her hand at acting. None of that was news to her. In fact, that was why she felt so pathetic. So, no, she didn't care if she got all the criticism from Haido, or all the harsh comments he'd just made. Couldn't he at least treat her like a fellow actor? As a younger colleague? Haido merely spared her a side glance, his lips curling into a mischievous smirk as he saw the dejection in her eyes. Then, without saying anything to her, he turned around and walked away. Lily turned to Myeong in defeat and apologized. Myeong waved it off and said she was glad Lily had gotten her spirits up. All Myeong could conclude from the scene she'd just witnessed was that her two co-stars were so intense. Surprisingly, the rest of the shoot went smoothly. Both Lily and Haido were so full of tension and pride, as if they were trying to prove a point to each other. From their heated exchange, Myeong felt a sense of alienation and defeat. It was on that note that the shoot ended. The director commended everyone for their efforts. He sang Lily's praises specially, and she thanked him. The director also thanked Haido and Myeong as well. Myeong reasoned that the results had turned out pretty well in spite of the process. She felt totally drained after the whole shoot and settled under a bridge to take a smoke. Haedo arrived on scene and advised that the smoke pieces were going to age her face, but Myeong didn't really care. Haedo leaned in close to her and explained that her looks were her livelihood. He asked her if she didn't think it was important to take care of herself. Myeong didn't say a word. Instead, she puffed a cloud of smoke in his face. Haedo coughed in exaggerated disgust and playfully called her rude. Myeong snickered, feeling a little mischievous herself. Then she put the piece out and put it away as she agreed with Haedo's claims about her looks. She confessed that she didn't have to audition for the drama. So it stung when he told Lily that any famous person was cast, just for the sake of ratings. Haedo flashed her an amused smirk and said she was good enough at acting to land roles without auditioning, so why was she letting his words get to her? Nothing he'd said to Lily mattered to her as long as she could act. She wasn't going to become a politician after all, so what was the need for being upright about everything? He gave Myeong a playful nudge. She laughed and mused aloud over his words. Then she pointed out to Haedo that she was only getting so much attention because the world thought she was the muse of a famous dead artist. But Haedo thought she was only getting the attention she deserved, all thanks to the media. Myeong looked at him, surprised by his perspective. Haedo explained that people didn't recognize diligent hard work. No one cared about the real person. They only cared about her carefully crafted image as an actor, the characters written out on scripts and the way she brought them to life with her acting. All they wanted was to fantasize about the made-up person. They wanted to fantasize about the actress, Myeong Yu. Myeong shrugged as his words sank in and admitted that the truth was quite hard to accept. Haedo suddenly remembered something and began searching inside his bag. He said he hadn't come to give her a lecture and fished out 2 tickets from the bag. He asked her to come and see his show. Myeong looked at the tickets in disbelief, surprised that he'd also been working on a musical while they worked on the drama. Haedo shrugged it off by admitting he was a workaholic. Then he asked her to come see the show with Hyo-yeon-jae. It was going to be nice for their 3 to get together again after so long. Myeong bit her lips before confessing that they'd broken up. Haedo was thrown into a state of frenzy and disbelief. He asked too many questions at the same time, and Myeong just said that she and Hyun-jae had just broken up a while ago. Haedo rubbed his head and said he'd had no idea. Then he apologized for his lack of tact. Then a few seconds of awkward silence passed between them before he called her name. He asked her if she wanted to date him. Myeong looked at him and told him that he still had no tact. On her way back to the apartment, Myeong searched Haedo Kang's name online. His filmography was very impressive, with numerous accolades. He was undoubtedly a great actor. But anytime she typed her own name into the search engine, all she saw was Artist's Muse. In order to survive as an actor, she had to prove herself through her work someday. Not in something trivial like a small drama, but a project that'd be remembered for a very long time. Then, as she was scrolling down, an article caught her eye, and it made her even more anxious. The movie Yenaban had been acting in had just won the Critics' Award at the Sea Film Festival. And there she was in the photo, Yenaban, looking all dolled up in her dress, as she smiled for the camera. At the festival, Yena was the center of attention, cameras flashing away around her. She was with 2 of her co-stars on the movie to receive the award, and one of them leaned in to whisper to her. He'd never attended a huge festival before, so he was so nervous. His heart was raving just at the thought of bumping into other actors at the after-party. But he knew Yena, on the other hand, was probably used to environments like this. He sighed and wished they'd come with other castmates for the festival. And he asked Yena if she agreed with him. She offhandedly agreed with him before looking away with a silent scoff. She wanted the guy to just shut his mouth up already. It was starting to annoy her. She wished she'd attended the event with Hyun-jae. She recalled the day she'd gone over to his apartment to watch the movie with him for the first time. As the credits rolled in the end, she'd gushed over how amazing the movie was with teary eyes. She'd been worried about the part leading to the ending, but he'd edited it. She leaned into him as she spoke. But Hyun-jae casually said he'd edited the part she'd spoken about and asked if it was okay. Yena thought okay was an understatement. It was more than just okay. It was more like an emotional roller coaster. She looked at him with eyes wide as saucers and said she was still sobbing. Hyun-jae rose to his feet and said she didn't have to exaggerate the reviews. He told her to leave if she was done watching the movie. But Yena explained that with movies, she wasn't just trying to pay lip service, no matter how much she liked him. Hyun-jae spun around at her words. Yena merely stared at him with a soft smile before she said she was sure things were going to work out for him this time. She reached for his hand and asked if when things did work out, he was going to make his directorial debut. She teased him by calling him Director Hyun-jae. Hyun-jae looked at her somewhat uncomfortable, but she ignored the signs. She asked him if he was working with her on his next project. She promised to make him an auteur. Yena's consciousness slowly returned to the present, the film festival. and her lips curled in a smirk as she told the other actor that she'd heard Hyunjae was going independent. The other actor agreed and said it was about time he did. Yeena smiled and said she was looking forward to Hyunjae's growth as a director. The following day, Myeong sat somewhere in the studio's lounge, flipping through the pages of a script as she recollected something she'd once heard. She'd heard someone say that massive amounts of attention could dissipate after 3 months, and Myeong thought that was just right. In fact, she thought it could take even shorter than that. The world was always changing, and people were always looking for something new. But ironically, they were comfortable with the familiar things that'll never let them down. Something tried and true. And that was why she was anxious. Myeong knew she had to make a mark on her audience before her title of Artist's Muse became a tired legacy. She'd not been able to get the thought out of her head ever since she saw the article about the Muse movie. She turned to manager Yoon and asked if he'd said the screenplay in her hands had won an award. She'd really enjoyed reading it. She'd made up her mind to audition for the movie first. Yoon explained that no director had picked up the project yet and asked her if that was okay with her. Myeong momentarily mused over it before waving it off. She asked Yoon if she could take it home to read it again, and he agreed. She thanked him and tucked it away in her bag. While at it, she spotted the tickets Haedo had given her the previous night. Haedo! After she'd told him that he had no tact when he'd asked her if she wanted to be his girlfriend, he'd blurted out that he'd been really happy when they were together. Myeong gave him a little skeptical look and said, with sarcasm in her voice, that he shouldn't have dumped her. Haedo agreed and admitted he'd been a dumb kid at the time. He even smacked himself in the head as if to prove a point. Then his phone had beeped and he'd gone back to the topic of inviting Myeong to see his show, and he wanted her to come with a friend. And of course, he didn't want her bringing a guy. Who did he think he was anyway? Myeong considered going with a man just to spite him. But who would she take? Then she glanced over her shoulder at Yoon, who gave her a blank stare in return. On the day of the show, and as you'd expect for a show starring someone as full of himself as Haedo, it was titled The Beautiful Guy. It was about a guy who used his good looks to his advantage. He was cheerful at times and plaintive at others. Myeong watched the OK with a strange feeling brewing in her stomach as she sat in the audience. As always, Haedo seemed to transform into someone else on stage. At the end of his performance, the crowd erupted with applause. Myeong met up with Haedo backstage afterwards and he thanked her for coming. Myeong handed him flowers and expressed her surprise at his ability to sing so well. Haedo took in his stride and said he was good at a lot of things. He asked if she'd come alone or with a friend. Not a guy, of course. And Myeong bluntly said she'd come with a man. Haedo was surprised, and a knock sounded on the door. Myeong turned to invite their guest in, but she saw someone she didn't quite expect. Lee. Yoon stood in the doorway. Both Myeong and Haedo were surprised, but for different reasons. Myeong was surprised to see Lee, while Haedo was surprised to see, well, a man at the door. Lee said hi to Myeong, who expressed surprise at bumping into her at the show. Haedo was puzzled. Didn't they both come together? Myeong was equally confused. She thought he'd invited her. Lee asked, her voice soft with appeal, why Haedo hadn't told her he was in a musical. Haedo asked if he was supposed to tell her that. Lee was dejected that he'd only told Myeong about the show and not her. Myeong could feel the tension building up, and there she was, standing right there in the middle of a weird situation. She felt really bad for Lee. Lee reminded Haedo that she'd asked him to treat her like a fellow actor, and he quickly cut her off by telling her that he'd stated he never would. Myeong quickly faked a call to escape their drama. Quick thinking. She let out a sigh of relief as she stepped out. Haedo and Lee only seemed to fight every other time they were around each other. There was no sign that things would get better between them anytime. At the doorway, she bumped into Yoon, who'd been standing outside the whole time. Myeong had forgotten about him. He hushed her and told her not to worry too much, because he thought Lee and Haedo were going to be just fine. Meanwhile, Haedo turned his back to Lee and fished inside the closet for his jacket. He asked her why she'd come to the show. Lee asked how she could be as amazing as he was. Haedo wondered if she was referring to his acting or singing, and she said she'd meant both. Haedo said he didn't know and asked if there was a method to those things. Then he advised her to use the time she was fussing over getting better with to actually get some practice done. Lee looked dejected. She slid her hat off her head and let out a sigh. Then she asked Haedo how he'd know what it felt like to be her. He'd never experienced her life, never had to work 2 jobs. He could afford a good life with just a credit card. Why did he always have to talk about her situation like it was so easy? She was terrified. Lee revealed that her finances were dwindling and she was losing money no matter how much she saved. There was no hope for her either. Hato had no idea what it felt like to pour all her time into trying to survive. Myeong was still at the doorway from where she recognized the familiarity of the words Lee-soo had just spoken. They were from the scene in their next shoot. The lady was practicing her role. Lee-soo continued. She told Hato that he could live as he pleased without the risk of going broke. He could do whatever he wanted without worrying about the cost. Hato looked at her speechlessly. Lee-soo added that if she'd only ever done what she wanted, she wouldn't be where she was. After those lines, she broke character and asked Hato if she'd done all right, if he'd finally acknowledge her. Hato casually told her she'd been a little over the board with her acting, the emotion in her monologue, and then her showing up at his show just to act. It was all too much. He told Lee-soo that she was putting too much pressure on herself to do a good job, and that was why she always froze up in front of the camera. Lee-soo gripped her hat helplessly and asked what she could do differently. Her voice was desperate. She had to do a good job. Hato looked at her with disbelief in his eyes and asked her why she was so desperate to do a good job. Myeong listened for Lee-soo's answer. Lee-soo said even though she was an idol, she was playing the lead role in the drama. Myeong reasoned that being treated the way Lee-soo was by Hato was enough to hurt anyone's pride, but the lady had been determined to come all the way to his show to ask him for another chance. She didn't think too much about things. All she had in her heart was the desire to do a good job. Myeong compared herself to Lee-soo. She was completely burnt out, alone in the dark, but if she still had Lee-soo's passion in her, with a small spark floating around the sun, she wanted to burn bright again. Myeong watched as Hato pulled out a script and began pointing out a couple of things to her. She thought about regaining her work again just by watching their pair. A few days later, Myeong was on set with Hato as his former lover. She looked into his eyes and asked him what he was going to choose, her or the other girl. Hato's character said she'd left him for a richer guy after all, and Myeong's lips curled up in a smirk. Then she asked him to forgive her. He leaned in close enough for their lips to be only inches apart. And then he asked if she'd let him do what he wanted. The director watched their scene from his camera screen. He was totally loving their acting. A crew member looked down at her phone screen and gasped in shock. Manager Yoon wondered what she'd seen. He observed her quietly, the way she looked at Myeong and Hato as if she was looking at ghosts. Did she see something online? He turned back to the scene and realized it looked familiar. He took out his phone to take a glance. His eyes landed on a photo from a blog, almost like a photocopy of the scene before them. Hato and Myeong in the same position as they were on set, only that they looked obviously younger, and the photo was part of Yoonmil's posthumous exhibition. Everyone wanted to know who the man in the photo was. How was it that things never worked out as one wanted them to? The director kept referencing the script as they acted. The shoot was in progress, and it was difficult to tell how much of it was just acting, and how much was the truth. Hato leaned in closer to Myeong, slowly, until he claimed her lips with his. In a trance, everything became jumbled. Subconsciously, Myeong thought about the character she was playing, Hirin. Hirin knew in her heart that Dojun, who Hato was playing, hadn't returned to her because he wanted to. But she closed her eyes and reminisced about their happy moments together, as she tried to believe him. As things blurted together, Myeong became Hirin and looked back on her own past. She'd been so happy with Hato. They always seemed so glued together. It felt like the heat was always going up. He made her that happy. This one time, they were alone in the club room for the first time in a very long time, and Hato wanted to be next to her. Literally. She'd playfully gripped his chin and reminded him that they'd only been apart for 2 days. Hato playfully slouched his head and said 2 days was too long to be away from her. Myeong found it funny and cute. Then Hato's grip on her side became more firm, and he moaned her name as he confessed to her that he was in the mood for some action. Myeong playfully asked what he'd meant, and Hato ignored her question as he asked if she thought they could do it there on the couch. Myeong immediately slipped into an anxious fit and asked him if he was out of his mind. But Hato didn't give her any time to think. He pressed his lips against hers. He pulled away and asked her why she was freaking out over a little kiss. Then with a playful smirk, he asked her what she'd thought he'd meant initially. Myeong was just so shocked to provide a coherent response immediately. And then she realized what he'd done, and her face stained a red shade in embarrassment. He'd baited her. He suddenly pushed her down without warning, and while he was crouched over her, he asked if they should keep going. Myeong told him that people were going to come around the place at any time, but Hato didn't care. After all, they'd kissed in front of said people in their last play. Myeong argued that had been different, but Hato felt it was all the same. And so, just like that, Hato brought his head slowly down to Myeong's. She'd relaxed into his touch and was going with the flow when someone broke in with a loud scream. Of course, it had been none other than Hyunji Woo, and he'd come with some ice cream. Haido and Myeong went straight into a state of alarm, still in the same position. Then, as if seeing them for the first time, Hyunji cleared his throat while the two moved away from each other. Hyunjae asked for them to keep the clubroom sacred, and they apologized immediately, the embarrassment still chirping away in the air around them. Hyunjae waved off their apologies and invited them to come have some ice cream. And then, the director's voice pierced through Myeong's nostalgia as he screamed, "Cut!" Myeong's eyes shot open. Her arms were still hanging over Haido's shoulders while his hands were around her waist. The director asked for them to move to the next scene. Haido, very much aware of the effect their little moment had just had on Myeong, quietly asked her if she'd thought about the old days. He told her that he had. He pulled her in for a hug and said acting was so fun because it could take one down memory lane. Myeong tried pushing away from him as she asked him to let her go, but Haido asked her to stay in his arms a little longer. Myeong realized that she'd become Hirin, the character from the script, even before she'd even known it. She forcefully pushed away from Haido, who flinched while calling her scary. Myeong waved off his talk about memory lane like it was very irrelevant. But deep down, she'd almost confessed that she'd thought about the old days while he held her. Then she added that Haido had romanticized the memories like they hadn't ended badly enough. But Haido didn't let down. He pointed out that they were back together shooting a drama. Myeong only gave him a little blank stare in response. But she could tell that the clocks of fate had started moving again, and their present was being influenced by a moment from their past. Haido looked away from her and asked why the vibe felt off in the air. A crew member walked up to them and asked if they were aware of something. Myeong was confused about her vagueness and asked what she meant. Then the crew member figured that neither of them had cleared the article she'd seen earlier. Myeong was even more confused. There was an article somewhere? The lady showed them the article that had been published. Myeong looked at in a mix of confusion and surprise as the realization slowly sank in. She recognized the photo of her and Haido from when they were just 20. Yoon came around and Myeong told him that the pictures were the same as the ones from the exhibition. She wondered who was behind their release. Yoon reassured her that the agency was trying to get the matter under control. Myeong read the caption, "A never-before-seen photo." Did that mean there were even more of them? Who had Eunmil's photos now? Was it his family? Myeong's mind was swimming with questions. Eunmil's body had been discovered by his cleaner, and that had been their first and only encounter. She'd never seen him before then. But what proof was there that the person she'd seen was Eunmil? Was Eunmil actually dead? Myeong reasoned. Or was she approaching the matter from the wrong perspective? Yoon drove her back home after the shoot, and he asked her not to worry about the article. The director, Ilha Bayek, believed the attention from the photo was going to help the drama positively. Myeong said she was all right, but worried that Haido would be affected negatively because of her. But the timing of the release of the photos? Myeong couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. Yoon assured her that Haido would be all right, because he was quite fond of her. Myeong asked how he knew that, and Yoon's next words left her hanging in shock. He said it was because he was always watching over her. For a moment, Myeong felt like she was standing in the presence of Eunmil. Then she brought up the topic of Eunmil to Yoon. She reminded him that he'd said the news had reported that Eunmil had died of a heart attack, but when they'd first met, he'd said Eunmil had taken his own life. She asked him why he'd made such a bold claim. Did he know Eunmil? Myeong was going to ask another question, but someone cut her off by calling her name. Myeong's eyes darted to the side. It was Jong. Myeong asked her what she was doing at the apartment. Jong said it had taken a little bit of searching to find her and asked why she'd changed her phone number. Myeong explained that she'd just gotten a new one when she got a new phone. Jung smiled and asked what she kept changing her numbers for when she could always find everything anyway. Then she stole a wary glance at Yoon before asking Myeong if she'd gotten a new man. Myeong was alarmed by her question. Yoon didn't seem fazed at all and reached out for a handshake. He introduced himself as Myeong's manager and handed John a card. John introduced herself as Myeong's younger sister, and then she handed him her own card. Yoon mused that Myeong had an impressive younger sister, an attorney at Forever Law Firm, and promised to remember her. John suddenly forgot how to use her words for some reason only she could explain. Perhaps it was Yoon's charm. Yoon excused himself with a bow, but not before leaning in to whisper into Myeong's ear and tell her to call him if anything happened. She said, okay, and Yoon carried on walking away. John was surprised that Yoon was Myeong's manager because she'd thought he was a celebrity. Then she remarked that it had to be nice hanging around him as she flipped his card over. She asked Myeong if nothing was really going on between her and Yoon, and Myeong gave her a flat no before asking why she'd tracked her. John ignored her question and said it was too bad that they weren't together because Yoon was better than the unshaven man she was with. She was obviously referring to Hyunjae. And then Jeon suddenly recalled why she'd come around. Their father wanted to see Myeong. Myeong asked why he wanted to see her. Was he looking to raise his blood pressure with her help? Jeon told her it was only going to be his 60th birthday very soon. She could come around, say hello, and have a meal with him, because it had been quite a while. Myeong declined and said she'd probably get indigestion by sharing a meal with him. But Jeon asked her to take a digestive before coming to tackle that problem. She slipped out a contact card and asked Myeong not to wear anything cheap or tacky, and not to reek of smoke. She handed the card to Myeong and asked her to save her number. She promised to come pick her up. And with that, Jeon got into her car and drove away. Myeong crumpled the card in her hand and cursed in frustration. Myeong attended the birthday party, and while at the table, her mother expressed her delight at seeing her. She said it felt so nice to have the family gathered together, and added that her father had been curious about her well-being. And as if summoned, her father entered the scene. He spared Myeong a side glare and asked why she was present. Jeon quickly jumped in and asked him not to be like that because Myeong had come a long way to celebrate his 60th birthday. But he didn't see the big deal in celebrating. He already felt like he had indigestion. Then Myeong said he should have taken a digestive medicine beforehand. She said she'd already eaten and he was the one who'd called her all the way. Then Myeong's father asked her if she really thought he'd ask her to come so he'd receive birthday wishes from her. He tossed a printout of the article of her and Haido that had trended on set. He told her that he'd only called her because he couldn't stand seeing the way she conducted herself in public. Myeong looked at it puzzled and asked what was wrong with it. Then he rhetorically said Muse was a nice way to put things before asking her what she was doing with the photographer who'd taken the photos or whoever he was. She'd moved out because she wanted to act. But here she was, caught in a vulgar scandal, plastered all over the internet. He asked if that was the dream she'd left home to pursue so badly. Myeong calmly explained that it was part of the process. But her father tapped the printout angrily and said the photo was exactly why he'd asked her to pick a career that's reward her hard work. The path she'd chosen didn't work on hard work and talent alone. Then he asked her how long she thought she could buy people's attention with her looks and youth. Myeong told him that she didn't believe acting relied solely on looks alone. Then her father asked her if she was implying that she didn't need her looks for her job. Myeong went silent, Una Key to provide an immediate response. Everything he was saying cut her heart like ice daggers. The cold daggers in her heart caused whatever passion she'd rediscovered to die. Myeong wanted so badly to take all the practical advice, the perception of so-called adults, and smash them all into pieces just to prove her point to them all. But she couldn't find the strength that would turn the tables. No matter how hard she tried to wrap herself in fancy packaging, her father always had the ability to see right, though. Then, while she was still battling with these realizations internally, he asked her to consider marriage as it wasn't too late. Myeong looked at him in shock. He explained that it was the best she could do with her youth at the moment. All he ever cared to do was wrap her up in a sensible package that looked acceptable to everyone. And oh, how she hated that. The way he broke her down with words that were all true, that becoming someone she wasn't was actually the real path she was supposed to be on. Like the first time Myeong had left home, she had nothing to say, so she just ran out. And out of habit, she called the number she'd always called. She held the phone to her ear and asked the contact if they could come to the subway station. She apologized for calling so late. Hyunjae was on the other end of the line, a voice that sounded familiar even where it shouldn't have. Myeong sighed and beat herself up for being so silly. She'd meant to call her manager Eun. She didn't know what to say to Hyunjae. She considered hanging up. Hyunjae didn't mind her silence and asked if it was tough getting all the sudden attention from people. He wondered what things had been happening to her, but he was happy she'd gone back to acting again. He said he was always rooting for her. Then his voice went soft as he called her name and apologized. Myeong couldn't take it any longer and ended the call. Hyunjae, he still had the same number. She slumped into a squatting position. They still treated each other the same way. His voice hadn't changed as well. It was still the same as always. Myeong felt like she'd changed more than her ex, with the photos and now her father's blunt remarks. Myeong wondered just what kind of person she'd become with the rate at which things were going. Thankfully, Eun had arrived. She got into the car and he drove off. There was an air of empty silence hanging around them before Eun broke it. He asked if she'd had a good time seeing her family. Myeong had been lost in thought before his question, so she managed to recover in time and say she'd had a good time. A very obvious lie. But Myeong corrected herself and admitted that she'd actually not had a good time. Her family didn't like that she was acting. As if that wasn't enough, she was involved in a scandal, so they were pretty furious. Myeong admitted that being a celebrity was a difficult life. Eun completed her statement by saying that celebrities went from receiving attention to enduring it. Myeong looked out of the car sadly. Eun reminded Myeong that she'd asked if he knew Eunmil, and her attention was instantly piqued. He confessed that he had something to share about Eunmil. He saved the truth for when they arrived at the apartment. Myeong had learnt from the last time and got them both glasses of juice. Manager Eun explained that before they'd met her, the agency had already reached out to Eunmil's people. That was when he'd been able to hear about Eunmil. Myeong excitedly reasoned that he definitely knew things about Eunmil. Eun explained that all he knew was that Eunmil was a regular person before his death. Myeong said everyone already knew that. But the man was dead anyway. Eun revealed that he'd heard the director Baek and Eunmil's people had made some sort of agreement, a contract. Myeong was surprised by this revelation. Eun said that she'd made the arrangement in exchange for all the photos of Muse Light. And in exchange, Metaphor Entertainment would stay silent about Eunmil forever. Then the realization hit Myeong. Was director Baek responsible for the leaked photos then? Eun emptied his glass and set it down on the coffee table. Then he said that he wasn't sure what the director had intended, but he believed she'd just wanted to build Myeong up as Eunmil's muse, and not just an actor. But Myeong stated that she wanted to be an actor and nothing more. Eun empathized with her and offered his help. Myeong said she wasn't sure why Eun was telling her all he had because he worked for the agency. Why was he trying to help her? Eun responded by saying he was her manager. That was his reason. He enjoyed her acting and wanted them to give it a real shot. Not as Eunmil's muse, but just as the actor herself, Myeong Yu. Myeong looked at him with hesitation. The following day, while on break from set, Lee Soo-lee was going through the comments on the article. Someone had figured out that Haido and Myeong had been dating at the time, and another pieced together that it explained why their acting felt so authentic. Another asked why no one ever talked about the drama itself, but shifted all the focus to the actors. Haido was in the room, so she walked up to him and said she'd seen the article. Haido wasn't following her point. But then she asked if the photo had been from a scene or he and Myeong were really dating at the time. Haido didn't wait for her to complete the statement before answering that they'd in fact been dating. A tiny gasp escaped Lee Soo's lips, and her eyes went wide in shock. Then she finally came to terms with the truth. Haido looked up at her and asked what she was doing standing around him. He told her to leave if she was done speaking. Lee Soo agreed and trudged away in defeat. But she suddenly stopped midway and asked if Haido and Myeong were still together. Haido seemed to think about the question for a while before saying that they were dating. And of course, Lee Soo was surprised to learn this. Lee Soo stuttered in embarrassment and admitted that she was just learning about their relationship for the first time. Then she mumbled something else about if she'd known before swallowing her words in embarrassment and offering an apology before trudging away in defeated silence. Haido gave her a side glance before raising his book back to his eyes to resume reading. Lee Soo had met Haido through the drama, but she'd always had genuine feelings for him. And now, it seemed she'd been the only one giving her heart, the only one in her excitement. And she'd been so alone in her love for Haido Kang. That was the truth. It felt very much like the drama they were starting in. In the end, he left to be with his first love, and she was left alone. Moments later, they were on set, acting a scene in the rain. Lee Soo's character looked up to Haido's and asked why he had to leave. Haido's character kept silent. Lee Soo's character if he loved his old girlfriend, and he said yeah. She called him an outright liar. Then a montage of their previous encounters rolled out on the screen. Lee Soo's character confessed that Haido's didn't look that old. She apologized for calling him Mr. and for getting mad at him, saying he wouldn't know what it felt like to worry about money, and for not being able to keep her promise. Lee Soo's character fell to her knees and apologized in the rain. She admitted that it was all her fault, and she begged him not to go. She begged him not to go to her. Then she confessed that she really liked him. Without warning, Haido's character knelt down in front of her and pulled her into his arms in a warm embrace. He held her close and apologized as well. Lee Soo's tears couldn't stop flowing. The scene they were currently acting, the fake rain spraying down over their heads, and the dozens of crew members watching them, everything was registered in her mind, including Haido's next line. Haido's character admitted that he'd liked her all along. As true as the words might have sounded, Lee Soo knew nothing was real. None of it. But it all felt so real to her. She wished it was real, because her tears and emotions were very real. And Lee Soo hoped that a tiny bit of everything felt real to Haido as well. She hoped that he'd finally look at her as Lee Soo Lee, even if it was just for a moment. The director cut the scene at that point. He praised Lily's acting and said it had felt so real. Lily thanked him through teary eyes and constant sniffling. Someone dropped a towel on her head and she looked up to find Haido smiling down at her. He commended her acting and asked her to dry herself up so she wouldn't catch a cold. He repeated that she'd done well this time around. He lifted his hand up to her head and gave her a fond pat. Lee Soo approached Myeong after the set and asked her why she'd lied. She said it would have been nice if she'd let her know when she'd confessed her feelings for Haedo to her. She felt silly for being the only one not in the know. Myeong just figured she'd only just seen the article. She began an apology that was cut short by Lee Soo's blunt question. She asked if Haedo and her were actually dating. Myeong was thrown off guard. Where had the question come from? Lee Soo carried on. She confessed that she didn't know about their relationship, and she let her feelings grow. So now, she wasn't sure what to do anymore. Myeong finally found the chance to stop her from soeking any further. Did she just say dating? She asked Lee Soo what she was talking about. She admitted that she'd dated Haedo in the past, but they weren't together anymore. Lee Soo asked her not to pretend for her sake, but Myeong insisted that she was telling the truth. They'd only dated briefly when she was 20, and then they broke up. Lee Soo was confused because Haedo had said otherwise. Myeong paused as the realization slowly sank in. Haedo. Of course. She understood what everything was all about. It was now Lee Soo's turn to be confused. Myeong told her to ask him again, and he'd tell her why he'd lied to her. Lee Soo marched off to Haedo's ride and slid the door open. Myeong had asked her not to take whatever reason he gave personally. Haedo was surprised to see her. He asked her what she wanted. Myeong also explained that Haedo had always been the kind of person not to care about anyone's feelings when it came to acting. She just went straight to the point and asked if it had been a lie. Haedo immediately caught on to what she was talking about. Lee Soo asked why he had to lie, and Haedo explained that she'd immersed herself in her acting, all thanks to him. Lee Soo was stunned. Myeong was right. Haedo cared about no one else's feelings when it came to acting. Lee Soo confronted him and asked how he could have guessed that she'd act better after he'd told the kind of lie he had. Haedo explained with a mischievous confidence that it was because she liked him. Lee Soo was shocked. He'd known all along. And that, Myeong had explained, was why she didn't want to date Haedo Kang again. Because the second Haedo Kang got a hold of your heart, he'd sweep you away, and you'd find yourself unable to differentiate between what's real and what's just acting. Curious to see what happens next? Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And hey, drop a comment below if you want to see part 2 or share your thoughts on this recap. The title of the manhwa is Muse on Fame, and today's recap covered the story up to chapter 20. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.